Welcome back. Now, we've just learned a lot about collision. And one of the things that we've learned about collision is that things can tend to get quite confusing when we go into our collision presets for any given component and change our collision presets to the custom option. And the reason for that is custom is a wildcard. One component's custom settings can be vastly different from another component's custom settings, whereas any of the other presets built into the engine will always be the same on any component that uses them, and this simplifies things a great deal. So when we can, we should use presets rather than setting these collision presets to custom and messing with the settings. There's nothing wrong with messing with the settings using custom, but once we zero in on the perfect settings, it's a good idea to generally create a new preset that we can reuse for different components. Now, some of the presets that come built into the engine that are less than ideal when it comes to performance are Overlap All and Overlap All Dynamic. Now, we can see what one of those look like by checking out our Small Sphere blueprint by going to the Small Sphere folder and opening BP Small Sphere. You see, our small sphere uses a sphere volume, and the sphere volume, by default, has collision presets set to Overlap All Dynamic, which has collision-enabled query only, object type world dynamic, and overlap responses to all collision channels. Now, our small sphere has a collision callback, right? It has an on-sphere overlap event bound to on-component-begin overlap for the sphere volume. And because this volume has its collision responses set to overlap every single channel, this event will be triggered when the sphere volume overlaps with literally anything. And this can cause a drastic hit to performance. I'd like to show the effects of this by going back into our testing level. Here in the testing level, I'm going to use a sphere spawner. We have one here, a BP sphere spawner. Now, I'd like to spawn a large number of spheres, and I'd like them all to have long lifetimes. So to clean things up, I'm going to close the asset editors that I don't need open here. I still have small sphere open. And for small sphere, I'm going to take the lifetime and set this to a larger value, such as 60 seconds. And then I'm going to go into sphere spawner and take the spawn time and set it to a lower value, such as 0.2 seconds. And now we should see a large number of spheres being spawned. Let's press play and take a look. Okay, and there's a large number of spheres. Now, because their overlap spheres have their collision responses set to overlap all, they should be triggering overlaps with each other. And we can see the result of that by going into our small sphere in on-sphere overlap, and we can print a string whenever we get an overlap. So what I'd like to do is make some room and simply use a print string node. I'm going to hook that wire in, and we can simply print the name of the other actor. If I drag other actor straight into inString, we get getDisplayName, which is similar to getObjectName. It returns a name in string form for the actor. Now we can go back to our testing level, and we can see messages being spammed to the screen, and there are quite a lot of them. So even though we don't need these callback events to be fired off, they're being fired off, and they're doing so very, very rapidly. Now, really the only time we ever want this on-sphere overlap callback to be called is when we overlap with it as the player-controlled pawn that we're flying around. That is the overlap event that we want to trigger. So even though we can't see it, these overlap events are being called, and that print string node allowed us to realize that. So what we're actually doing is triggering a whole bunch of these on-sphere overlap events, and then filtering the results afterwards by checking to see if the other actor being overlapped is a pawn, and then we're casting to our game mode and incrementing our score, and then winking out of existence. So this business of filtering the results after the collision is an opportunity for an optimization. We can make things much more optimal by making our sphere volume no longer overlap with just everything. The only thing we want to overlap with is the player-controlled pawn. Now let's look at that. If we go to bot pawn and open BP bot pawn, the only component that our small sphere wants to overlap with would be the bot mesh. And if we select the bot mesh and scroll down, we'll see that its collision presets is block all dynamic, which has the object type world dynamic. Now, most of the moving things in our world have world dynamic as its object type. Our small sphere itself has a sphere volume with object type world dynamic. So if our sphere volume has an overlap response to world dynamic, it's going to continue triggering those overlap events with other small spheres. So our bot pawn mesh should use a different object type. Now we can choose a different collision preset. Here's one that's kind of what we want. It's called character mesh. Its collision enabled is set to query only, no physics collision. Its object type is pawn. And its response to the visibility channel is ignore. Its response to the camera channel is block. World static and world dynamic have block responses, as well as physics body and destructible. Now, we don't really have objects using physics body or destructible or vehicle, so we're not too concerned with those. And so far, only our bot pawn has a component now using object type pawn. So if we use this collision preset, then we can go back to our small sphere and we can give it presets that ignore everything except the pawn, and then we'll only trigger overlaps with the pawn. Now, to test that theory, we can set collision presets to custom and then use ignore for all responses. If we check the topmost checkbox, it'll set all the responses to ignore for every object type. And then we can simply set the response to pawn to overlap. Now, the small sphere's sphere volume collision response to pawn is overlap, and if we go back to bot pawn, we see that the bot mesh collision response to world dynamic, which is the sphere volume's collision object type, is block. So analyzing the two responses, we have block and we have overlap. The least blocking interaction between block and overlap is overlap. So when the bot pawn's mesh comes into contact with the sphere volume, we'll have an overlap response. Any other object type other than pawn coming into contact with the sphere volume will have an ignore interaction. So now we shouldn't expect to see so many strings printed to the screen, but let's make sure. I'm going to press play, and now we have no messages printed to the screen. Now, we can fire blaster beams into this cloud of spheres. And we don't get any overlap events. Now let's fly into some spheres with our pawn, and we're getting overlap events. So we've just made a huge optimization by making our spheres ignore all collision object types except for the pawn, and in our game there is only one component with that collision object type, and that is the drone mesh being used by our bot pawn. So that's a great optimization that we've made, except now our small sphere's sphere volume is using the custom collision preset, and we should avoid using custom once we're finished zeroing in on the correct collision settings. So what we can do is make a collision preset specifically for the small sphere's volume. We can do this by going to Project Settings. Under Engine, we can go to Collision, and under Preset, here are the collision presets, and here is where we can create a new one. We click on New, and we give our new collision preset a name. Now, in general, any sort of pickup in the game that only the player should be able to pick up should have these presets. So I'm going to call this collision preset pickup. This will be designed for overlap volumes like our sphere volume. Collision enabled can simply be query only, as we don't need physics, and the object type can be set to world dynamic, as our pickups may need to move. And for the description, we can say, for pickups designed to only overlap with the player. And our collision responses can be ignore for everything except for pawn, and that response will be overlap. Let's go ahead and accept that. And now we can go into small sphere and click compile and change our collision presets to the newly created pickup preset. If you don't see it here, make sure you compile first and then you should see it. And now our small sphere has the pickup collision preset, which has query only, world dynamic, and ignore for all collision channels except for pawn. And because our bot pawn is using that, we still get overlap events for the pawn. And what's great is that if we go into drone and open BP bot, our bot mesh for BP bot, if we scroll down, is block all dynamic. Its object type is world dynamic, and the small sphere is configured to ignore world dynamic. So our BP bots are not going to trigger unwanted overlap collision interactions with our small sphere's sphere volume. So we've just performed a very nice optimization for our overlap volume. Since we don't need this print string anymore, I'm going to remove it. And now our project is performing quite a bit better. Excellent job. I'll see you in the next video.